Hey, Pat McCardle here for another episode of Shop Talk. For the next few episodes, we're going to cover off on some awesome Ranger content. So I got my good buddy Chris Hendricks here, who's the product manager for Ranger. Chris, what are we going to dive into on this first one?
This first episode, we're going to be talking about all things Ranger engines. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Ranger XP1000, the Ranger 1000, and the differences between the two of them.
Let's dive in on, what's the same on these two engines, right? And really, from about here down, they're pretty much identical, right?
Yeah, the crankcase, the cylinders, the whole bottom end of the engine is essentially the same across the XP1000 and the Ranger 1000. Where they really start to get different is up in the top end, where the valves get actuated. The Ranger XP1000 is a dual overhead cam engine. The Ranger 1000 is a single overhead cam engine. And that's really the big difference between the two of them. But I think before we start to really dive in onto that, Pat, I want you to explain for our viewers, what is a cam? What's an overhead cam? What does a cam do? Let's start with some basics, and then we can get into the specifics of what's different between these two vehicles.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the marketing team was nice enough to let us borrow this cutaway engine for demonstration today.
They told us we could use it as long as we were nice to it, and then Pat started unbolting stuff and taking it apart.
Well, we figured we better get at, the actual camshaft, which is this guy right here on the top of the motor, right? So it's a shaft that runs from the back to the front in this view, where you got a chain on one side that the crank drives to make it spin. And then you got these lobes that come off that actually, push down on the buckets that open the valves. So the nice thing about these overhead motors, overhead cam motors, is that, you're basically having the camshaft push right on the valve itself. Unlike a pushrod motor where the camshaft would sit down by the crank and have a big pushrod going up with a rocker arm. So it gets rid of a lot of unnecessary parts and makes for a more efficient design.
Yeah, so to summarize, there's a chain that drives a shaft with cams on it. That's a camshaft. Those are on top of the motor, overhead, and that's what an overhead cam engine means, and that's kind of how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, just for demonstration purposes, we unfortunately have this, dry engine right here. So it might be making some creaks and moans, but let me grab a ratchet and just turn the crankshaft. And what you guys will see in the, on the video here is the piston will be moving down. This cam will actually start rotating around, push on this valve, and open up this intake valve. So might be a little noisy as we go, but we'll try and show you a little bit about how this thing works in slow motion here.
It's a good demonstration of the fact that Pat hasn't been to the gym in a while. It's a little hard to turn the crank without some oil in the engine.
Yeah, it turns out engines without oil aren't the best, but they do look pretty for visual display purposes here. So, this is obviously the Ranger 1000 motor with this single overhead cam design. So Chris, why is it that we have two different engines in the Ranger 1000 versus the Ranger XP 1000?
There's a couple of different reasons. And the main one is that they're meant to be optimized to do different things better. The Ranger XP1000 is a dual overhead cam engine. It's optimized to really give us as much torque and horsepower as we can while still making a really reliable engine. The single overhead cam in the Ranger 1000 is really optimized for work. And when we say work, we mean low end, lower speed, slower operations. And where the Ranger 1000 engine really excels is in the low to mid range. It's producing that torque earlier in the cycle, and it's got a really flat torque curve. So it's a better engine when it comes to smooth performance while you're doing work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, both are great engines for the application in the vehicles they go into. I think we got a couple, empty heads sitting over here that we can kind of show, on a single overhead cam where, that camshaft is really, operating all four valves. On the dual setup, you've got one cam for the intake side and one for the exhaust side. So, Chris, we'll have you tip up this one. This is the same as what was on the engine we had on the cutaway display. And you can kind of see where the camshaft would sit right at the top of this motor. And there's a spot, two valves for each of the cylinders, right? So you got an intake valve and an exhaust valve, so kind of one for each of the cylinders on that engine.
Yeah, and one of the things we really like about this design is it's simpler. So there's just less parts in a single overhead cam engine. That means it's easier to manufacture. It also costs less. So you'll notice there's a big difference in the price tag between these two vehicles, and that's one of the benefits.
Yeah, certainly the engine's part of that, right? So if we tip up this other head, this is the dual overhead cam setup off the XP 1000. And what you see is we've got one cam here for the intake side, so the air comes in through the ports, and we've got one for the exhaust side. And again, here you can see we've got two valves per cylinder for intake and two per cylinder for exhaust. So we can actually flow more air through this setup, allows for a little higher rev range and a little bit of higher horsepower performance out of the XP 1000 motor. So, different engines, bottom ends are basically the same, but, a lot of differences here when you get into the top end for sure.
Yeah. This simpler design in the Ranger 1000, you've got to put the camshaft right in the middle of the head. And while that allows you to operate the engine with only one camshaft, it also means that you've got less rotating mass up in the head. And so when I talked about being able to achieve your torque earlier and lower in that RPM range, that's one of the reasons that our engineers are able to do that, is because there's less stuff that chain has got to actually turn up in the top end of the engine.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, if you flip these things over and you look at kind of the bottom deck surface on the head and try and align them that they're the same way. The other big thing that you notice that's different is just the size of the valve openings, right? So all these areas where you see the valve seats, you've got basically couple of intake and exhaust on each side, where you've just got one of each on that Ranger 1000 engine. And you can see just how big those valves would be if they were in this head compared to the smaller ones here. So again, you can flow more air with this because you've got to, but for that lower grunt, that torque, kind of that work, this single valve or single cam with one valve on the intake side and one on the exhaust side actually does work a little better at the low range.
Yeah, so if you look at these the dual overhead cam engine on the side, having two cams and having them more towards the outside of the head allows you to really optimize where those are, to the point Pat made, which means that you've got more valves per cylinder and you can ultimately provide more flow. Whereas in the Ranger 1000, you line them up right in the center and you got less rotating mass. You can make that torque earlier, but you can't make the ports quite as big or have quite as many of them. So there's trade-offs to both designs.
Who's the guy that buys the Ranger, or the person that should be looking at the Ranger 1000 versus the Ranger XP 1000? Like, which one's better for what kind of work? Sure.
Well, we'll start with the Ranger 1000. This vehicle is a lower priced vehicle than the XP 1000. So right now it's about $3,800 less in the MSRP versus an XP 1000. However, it's got all of the same capability of an XP 1000. So your towing capacity, your box capacity, the box size, all the things that allow a Ranger to do work are the same on this engine, but it's got a lower price tag. The other thing that's really nice is this engine and the overall vehicle is going to be really smooth in the low range. So if you're somebody that's more focused on getting work done on a farm, maybe you're doing maintenance around your property, or you're just going out and taking your friends and family hunting or doing things in the outdoors, this is going to be a smoother engine. It's going to give you your torque earlier, and it's going to make for a more comfortable overall ride while you're doing work. Now, if you go over to the XP 1000, this is the vehicle that costs a little bit more money. It's got more parts in it. It's a little bit more complex. But as we showed on those engine cutaways, it's also got more horsepower. Pat, what does more horsepower mean?
Well, I mean, being a guy that does a lot of razor riding, it means you can go faster.
Exactly. So there are benefits to having a dual overhead cam engine, and that's that you can get better overall acceleration, higher overall top speed, and the vehicle can just be more fun to ride. So if you're doing both work and play with your Ranger, it might be worth stepping up into an XP 1000, paying that little bit of extra money, because ultimately it's going to be more fun to ride. It's going to be more powerful overall. If you're an adrenaline junkie, if you're anything like Pat at all, you're going to want to get an XP 1000. If you're just using your Ranger to get work done or to facilitate other things that you want to do with your friends and family, it's kind of more how I use my Ranger. The Ranger 1000 is actually a really good choice because of some of those benefits I mentioned.
All right, so Chris, when I look back here, I see that the intakes are different, right? What are kind of the big things that people can visually see on the outside of the vehicle to know which one's which when they're talking intake differences?
That is the big difference between the Ranger 1000 and the XP 1000. On the Ranger 1000, the intakes come in on the side of the vehicle. So this is your clutch intake. Your engine air intake is on the other side. And as we walk up to the front of the vehicle, that's actually different on the XP 1000. So I'll take this hood cover off and show you guys. So here you go, Pat. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So on the Ranger XP 1000, the intakes actually come in through the front. And that's a big benefit if you're living out west or you're in really dusty conditions. Having your intakes on the front of the vehicle means you can get really clean air. And that's these two things right here. So the air actually comes in and goes down through the tunnel of the engine and through the back. Whereas on the Ranger 1000, it comes in through the sides.
Yeah, so Chris, are there a couple other big things you want to highlight differences between the Ranger 1000 and the Ranger XP 1000?
We won't hit on them in detail today, but I would say overall, there are a lot of nice, we call them bells and whistles on an XP 1000. So this machine is going to have nicer seats. It's got some nicer details, more painted surfaces. And it's got some more options that you can get from the factory too. So on an XP1000, you can get air conditioning from the factory, things like that. So it is, not only is the engine a little bit different, but it's also paired with some more premium or a little bit nicer features on the XP1000. But overall, when you talk about work capability and what these two machines can do, we mentioned it earlier, but it's same box capacity. It's literally the same box size. And it's got the same towing capacity. So if you're just interested in doing work done, or getting work done, and you're not as much of an adrenaline junkie like Pat, both vehicles can do the same thing just fine.
So, you know, for somebody that's never paid this much attention to the differences in details, you know, they walk into a dealer, what are they really gonna see on the side of a machine to know which one's which?
Well, we made it easy for you, Pat, and actually put stickers right on the side of the vehicle. So even if you've got no technical expertise at all, we made it pretty easy for you. You can just look at the front fender, and it's pretty clear which one's a single overhead cam, which one's a dual overhead cam.
All right, so we just learned a ton about the Ranger 1000, the Ranger XP 1000, differences between the single cam, the dual overhead cam motors. You know, pretty cool to have you here, Chris. What do we need everybody that's watching this online to do?
Well, if you guys like this video, we need you to like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know how we did on the episode. If you've got any more questions, we'd be happy to answer them. And give us your recommendations if you guys want to see some more episodes of Shop Talk about Rangers.